The cold wind howled across the empty snow fields of planet Iran 7. The sky was always gray, and the sun never showed its face. Dan pulled his coat tighter and kept walking. He had lived alone on this planet for 3 months. The mining crew had left early because of a system failure. Only Dan stayed behind to protect the last equipment before pickup. He was used to silence snow and broken machines. On this morning, his scanner beeped. A faint life signal was blinking far off near the northern ridge. Dan stopped. The scanner was old, but it didn't lie. He checked the map. Nothing should be out there. No animals, no humans, no shelters, just frozen rocks and wind. He narrowed his eyes and decided to check it out. Curiosity was stronger than caution. It took him an hour to reach the location. As he walked up the ridge, he saw something unusual. A crash pod was half buried in the snow. Smoke rose from its broken engine. Metal pieces were scattered around like fallen leaves. The ship wasn't human-made. It had a round shape, smooth design, and glowing symbols. Dan stepped closer, carefully, watching his scanner. The life signal was still there, weak, almost fading. He circled the pod and found the source. His eyes widened. Lying beside the wreckage was a girl. Not human. Her skin was light blue, and her hair was white like ice. Her clothes were torn, made from shiny fabric. She had thin arms, small hands, and strange silver markings on her face. She looked young, maybe around 16 in human years. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were cracked. She wasn't moving, but her chest rose slowly. She was breathing. Dan knelt beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" he said gently. No answer. He opened his pack and took out an emergency meal bar. He unwrapped it and held it near her mouth. The smell seemed to stir her. Her eyes opened slightly. They were deep purple, full of fear and pain. She looked at Dan, then at the food. Dan placed the bar in her hand. She took it slowly, fingers trembling. She looked at it for a moment, then took a small bite. At first, she chewed slowly. Then, suddenly, she began to eat faster. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she ate. Her hands shook. Her shoulders moved up and down as if she was sobbing, but no sound came out. Dan didn't know what to do. He just sat beside her, quiet. After a minute, she finished the bar and leaned back. Her eyes stayed on him. She said something in a soft, unknown language. "I don't understand," Dan said. "But you're safe now." She didn't move. She just stared, eyes filled with emotion, then looked around. The crash site was too exposed. If she stayed here, she would freeze. He had to bring her back. "I'm going to carry you," he said. She didn't fight. She was too weak. He lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected. Her body was cold like ice. He wrapped her in his thick outer coat and began the slow walk back to his shelter. Snow crunched under his boots. The wind picked up, biting his face. He looked down once. The alien girl had closed her eyes again. Her head rested on his shoulder. By the time Dan reached the shelter, the wind had turned into a storm. He placed her on a small bed and turned on the heating system. The room was small, just enough for one person. Now it held to Dan boiled some water and made warm soup. He offered it to her. She took it with both hands and drank slowly this time. No crying, just silent sips. He noticed her eyes followed his every move, cautious, curious. After finishing the soup, she leaned back against the pillow. Dan smiled and pointed to himself. "Dan," he said. She tilted her head. He pointed again. "Dan." She touched her chest. "Ni, Ra," she said softly. "Nira?" Dan repeated. She nodded. Dan smiled. "Nice to meet you, Nira." She looked confused but tried to smile too. It was a small, weak smile, but it was real. Dan brought out a small translator device from his toolbox. It was old and half-working, but maybe it could help. He turned it on and placed it on the table. A soft hum came from the machine. Nira watched it closely. She said a few words. The device beeped but didn't respond. Dan adjusted the settings and tried again. This time, her voice came through the speaker, broken and slow. "Escape crash, alone hungry." Dan looked at her. You escaped something. She nodded slowly. He didn't ask more. She was tired. He gave her a blanket and let her rest. That night, as the storm raged outside, Nira slept under a human blanket in a human shelter. Dan sat nearby, watching the wind hit the windows. He had found something unexpected today. Not just an alien, not just a survivor, but someone who cried over a meal. He didn't know who she was, or what danger followed her, but he knew one thing. She wasn't just a visitor. She needed help, and Dan was ready to give it. The storm outside lasted for 2 days. Snow piled against the shelter walls, and the sky remained heavy with clouds. Dan stayed inside, checking the heating system, power unit, and water recycler. But most of his time was spent watching Nira. She stayed in bed, silent but alert. Her eyes followed him wherever he moved. She didn't speak much, only said soft words in her language that the translator could not understand yet. But she was calm. She didn't act like a threat. Dan gave her food every few hours. She ate slowly now, not like the first time. Her hands still shook sometimes, but not from fear. She was weak. Her body needed time to recover. On the 3rd day, the storm stopped, the sky cleared, and light returned through the frozen glass. Dan brought a chair near the bed. He smiled and held out a small metal cube. It was a simple learning tool from the mining ship, used to teach workers basic languages. The cube showed pictures, played sounds, and responded to touch. He hoped it could help Nira learn human words. She took the cube carefully. Her fingers were long and thin, with soft lines of silver on them. She touched the cube and watched the pictures change. First came the image of food, then the sound, food, then water, then sleep, then friend. Dan said, pointing to himself. Nira looked at him, then at the cube. She touched the friend picture again. Dan nodded. Yes, friend. She gave a small smile, her first real one. Later that day, Dan turned on the translator again. He checked the settings, updated the voice log, and asked, "Can you say something?" Nira paused, then she spoke slowly. Her words were broken, but the translator picked them up, cold. Long time, ship fall. I run. Dan leaned forward. Run from what? She shook her head. Bad. People catch many. I go, alone. Ship break. Dan didn't push. She was still learning. But her message was clear. She had run from something dangerous, and others didn't escape. That night, Dan sat at his work table, fixing old tools. Nira sat across from him, watching. She had wrapped herself in a blanket and held the learning cube in her lap. Sometimes she pressed it and repeated the words in a soft voice. Safe, she said once. Dan looked up. Yes, safe. She looked round the shelter. This, home? He smiled. For now, yes. Nira nodded and hugged the blanket tighter. The next day, Nira stood up for the first time. She walked slowly, still weak, but her balance was good. Dan helped her to the window. She looked out at the white land, the frozen rocks, and the distant hills. No stars, she whispered, then looked up too. They'll be back tonight. She turned to him. I like stars. Dan pointed to a panel on the wall. Want to see something better? Nira nodded. He opened the panel and turned on the sky projector. A soft blue light filled the room, and stars appeared on the ceiling. Planets, moons, comets, all moving slowly. It was part of the shelter's entertainment system. Dan hadn't used it in weeks. Nira stared in silence. Her eyes reflected the stars above. She walked under them, her arms out like she wanted to touch them. My moon not here, she said. Your moon? Dan asked. She pointed to a small moon on the display. No, not this, mine, hidden, far. Dan walked to the console and opened the map settings. Can you show me? She tried, but her fingers were unsure. She moved the map around, but couldn't find the right place. Then she stopped and looked at him. Too far. Not on this map. Dan nodded. That's okay. We'll find it later. Nira sat down again. This time near the fire unit. Dan noticed. She was quieter now. Not scared, just thinking. After a while, she looked up. You, alone? She asked. Dan nodded. Yes, Everyone left. I stayed to finish repairs. Why? Dan shrugged. I don't like giving up. Nira tilted her head. You not leave me. No, Dan said. I won't. She smiled again. Bigger this time. That evening, Dan went outside to check the signal tower. The wind was light and the air clear. He climbed the short hill and looked around. No signs of life. No tracks, just snow. But something bothered him. He checked the tower logs. The scanner had recorded a faint signal 2 days ago, just before the storm started. It wasn't human. It came from the crash site. Dan returned to the shelter and checked Nira's clothes. He found a small metal piece stitched inside her coat. It had tiny lights and symbols. What's this? He asked. Nira's eyes widened. She reached for it, then stopped. She looked afraid. Beacon, she said. They follow. Dan's voice became serious. Who? Nira answered slowly. Zorans. Dan had heard that name once. A powerful alien group from the outer systems. Not friendly. Not peaceful. They want you? He asked. She nodded. Want all? My people taken? I run. Dan held the beacon in his hand. If this thing was still active, it could bring danger here. He placed it on the table. We'll turn it off, he said. Nira looked at him, eyes full of worry. You're not alone. Anymore, he said. I'll protect you. She looked at him for a long time, then gave a slow nod. Dan picked up his tools. He was no soldier, but he was human. And humans didn't walk away when someone needed help. Days passed slowly on the frozen planet. The snow kept falling, but inside the shelter, Dan and Nira worked hard to prepare for what might come next. Dan knew they could not stay hidden forever. The Zorans were too powerful, and their ships could find anyone they chased. Nira had grown stronger. Her arm had healed, and her eyes shone with hope. She no longer stayed quiet. She spoke more in broken English, and Dan tried to teach her new words every day. One morning, Dan turned on the radio. It was weak, but he hoped for a signal from the human patrol ships nearby. He adjusted the frequency many times. Suddenly, a crackling voice came through. This is Patrol Ship Orion. Anyone out there, please respond. Dan's heart jumped. He grabbed the radio. This is Dan from Iran 7. I'm here with a survivor. We need help. The voice was clear now. We hear you, Dan. Sending coordinates. Stay where you are. Dan smiled and told Nira. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. They come. She whispered. Dan nodded. Help is coming. The waiting was hard. Days turned into nights, and the cold bit harder. Dan and Nira stayed near the window, watching the sky. Then, a bright light appeared on the horizon. It grew bigger and bigger. A human ship landed softly on the snow. Soldiers in bright suits came out, carrying weapons and supplies. Dan ran outside. To meet them, he waved his hands and shouted. The soldiers smiled and helped unload equipment. One of the officers came close to Nira. She looked shy but stayed near Dan. The officer spoke slowly. We got your message. We're here to help. You're safe now. Nira smiled. For the first time, she laughed. Her voice was soft but clear. Thank you. The soldiers checked the area. They found signs of the Zorns' attack. Dan told them everything he knew. How Nira came, how the Zorns chased her, and how they fought. The officer looked serious. Zorns are strong, but humans never give up. We will help your people. Nira looked at Dan. My people still hidden. Many still trapped. Dan put a hand on her shoulder. We will find them together. Over the next days, the human patrol set up a base near Dan's shelter. They brought food, medical supplies, and weapons, then helped them prepare for a rescue mission. Nira practiced using human equipment. She learned to use a small laser pistol and a shield. She was fast and smart. The soldiers liked her and called her Star because her eyes shone like stars. One night, around the fire, Dan and Nira talked quietly. Do you miss your home? Dan asked. Nira nodded. Very much. But now, I have new home. Dan smiled. Good. You're part of my home now. Nira reached out and took his hand. Thank you for saving me, for not leaving. Dan looked at the stars and said, sometimes Saving one person can change many lives. The patrol's leader planned the rescue. They would take a small team to Nera's hidden moon. It was risky. The Zorns guarded it with ships and soldiers. But they had to try. Before the mission, Nera gave Dan a small gift. It was a pendant shaped like a star, made from metal and stone. "For hope," she said. Dan held it close. "I'll keep it safe." The next morning, the rescue team prepared to leave. Nera stood with Dan and the soldiers. "Be careful," Dan said. Nera smiled bravely. "We bring freedom." As the ship lifted into the sky, Dan watched it disappear among the stars. He knew the fight was only beginning. But humans never gave up. The sky above planet Iran 7 turned dark again, and stars began to shine. The wind had slowed, and the cold had softened, but inside the shelter, a different kind of storm was building. Dan placed the small beacon device on his work table. The silver metal blinked softly, sending out a weak signal. It was the reason Nera had been found. Not by him, but by something else that might still be out there. Nera stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself. She stared at the beacon with fear in her eyes. "Zorns use this to find runaways," she said softly. "Why didn't you throw it away?" Dan asked. "I didn't know it'd still work," she replied. "I thought Crash broke it." Dan looked at her. "You said they follow. How dangerous are they?" Nera stepped forward and touched the table. "Very. They have ships, soldiers, machines. They take people, then burn places so no one can go back." Dan picked up the device. He had no doubt she was telling the truth. He opened the beacon carefully. Inside were thin wires, a small power cell, and one glowing chip. He had seen enough tech in his time to understand how it worked. He took a tool and cut the main wire. The light on the chip stopped blinking. "It's off now," he said. Nera let out a slow breath. "But that doesn't mean they're gone," Dan added. "If they got a signal before the storm, they may be on their way." Nera nodded. "Maybe. One day. Maybe now." Dan stood up and walked to the window. Snow covered the hills, but the sky above was clear to clear. He didn't like it. "We need to be ready," he said. The next morning, Dan and Nera worked together. They set up motion alarms around the shelter using old mining sensors. Dan taught Nera how to use a flare gun, just in case. She learned quickly. Her hands were steady. She had a quiet strength he had not noticed before. That evening, they sat near the heater, eating a simple meal. Nera spoke more than before. "My people live on Hidden Moon," she said. "We have farms, water. Zorns come in dark ships. They say we must give them workers." Dan listened carefully. "We say no. They take many. My sister, gone. My mother hide me. I run in small ship." Dan could see the pain on her face. "He didn't interrupt. My ship break. I fall here. You're safe now," Dan said. Nera looked at him. "For now." The translator crackled, but her voice came through clearly. Later that night, Dan checked the sky with his long-range scanner. It could see ships before they entered the lower atmosphere. He pressed the screen and waited. The stars blinked out then. Something strange appeared. A shape moved between the stars. Not natural. Not a comet. It was long, black, and silent, then leaned closer. His heart began to pound. He ran back inside. "Nera," he said quickly, "I think a ship is coming." She stood up fast. "Zorns? I don't know yet, but we have to be ready." Dan turned off all power inside the shelter. Darkness fell. Over the room, only the small fire glowed. He gave Nera a flashlight and took a laser cutter from the toolbox. It wasn't a weapon, but it could defend. The sky above grew darker. No sound, no engine, just a shadow moving closer in our past. Then, from the window, Dan saw something land on the snow near the ridge. A black shape touched down quietly. No lights. No signal. It looked like a hunter's craft. Nera stared. "Through the glass. That is Zorn's scout. Only 3 can ride." Dan's voice became cold. "Then we fight 3. He moved to the back wall and opened a metal box. Inside was a mining laser, meant for cutting stone. It was strong, but slow to charge. "I'll handle this," Dan said. "You stay inside." Nera shook her head. I help. I not run again. Dan looked at her. Her eyes were steady. She was not the weak girl from the snow anymore. All right, he said. We defend this place together. They moved quickly. Dan set traps round the entrance. He placed heat mines under the snow and hooked wires to his scanner. Nira climbed to the roof hatch with a flare gun and kept watch. Then came the moment. Snow crunched. 3 shadows moved toward the shelter. Dan pressed his back against the wall, waiting. A soft beep came from the sensor. The first trap exploded, lighting up the snow. 1 Zoran soldier flew backward. The others crouched and moved faster. Nira fired the flare. It hit one in the shoulder, burning his armor. He roared in anger and fired a bolt toward the roof. It missed. Dan stepped out and fired the mining laser. It hit the 3rd Zoran in the chest. He dropped to the ground with a thud. The last Zoran rushed forward faster than Dan expected. He tackled Dan to the snow. The laser cutter flew from his hand. The Zoran raised his weapon. Then Nira appeared behind him. She held a metal rod and struck the Zoran's head with all her strength. The alien turned and grabbed her arm. She cried out but didn't stop, then grabbed his tool again and fired at the Zoran's leg. The alien fell with a loud growl. Silence followed. Snow fell gently as Dan stood, breathing hard. Nira leaned on his arm. She was hurt, but still standing. All 3 Zorans were down. Dan looked at her. You all right? She nodded slowly. I am. Together, they dragged the Zoran bodies away from the shelter and covered the scout ship with snow. They took the enemy tools and locked them inside. By morning, the danger had passed. Dan looked at the horizon. They'll send more. Nira looked at the stars. Then we warn others. Dan nodded. But first, we survive. The ship moved fast through the cold darkness of space. Inside, Nira sat quietly with the rescue team. Her eyes were fixed on the view of her hidden moon growing larger on the screen. She was no longer the scared girl who had crashed on Iran 7. She was a leader now, a voice for her people. The team prepared for the mission ahead. The captain, a tall man named Mark, spoke to everyone in the small room. We know the Zorans are watching. This will not be easy. But we have one chance to free Nira's people. Nira nodded. They are trapped. They need us. The ship entered the moon's orbit. The hidden world was covered with forests, lakes, and mountains. But smoke rose. In many places, the Zorans had already begun their attack. The team landed on a forest clearing. Quiet and tense, they moved forward. Nira led them to a small village hidden in the trees. Inside, dozens of her people waited. They looked tired, scared, and hungry. But when they saw Nira, their faces lit with hope. My friends, Nira said softly, help has come. The rescue team quickly gave food, water, and medicine. The villagers thanked them with tears and smiles. But there was no time to rest. Zoran ships were closing in fast. The team set up defenses around the village. Dan's gift, the star pendant, hung around Nira's neck. It reminded her of the promise made far away on the frozen planet. The Zoran attack came at night. Bright ships fired lasers, and soldiers marched through the trees. The rescue team and villagers fought bravely. Nira used what she had learned with the humans. She fired laser pistols and guided the villagers to safety. Captain Mark called the team back to the ship. They could not hold the village forever. Nira looked back at her home. We will return, she promised, back on the ship. Dan's voice came through the radio. Nira, are you safe? She smiled. Yes, we fight. We survive. The captain sent a message to Earth Command. He told them about the hidden moon, the captured people, and the Zoran threat. Nira was more than a survivor now. She was a symbol. A message of hope and courage. Earth listened. Dan watched the stars from the base on Iran 7. He held the pendant tightly. One small act of kindness, a meal shared in the snow, had changed everything. The fight was far from over. But now, they were not alone. Snow fell lightly as the sun slowly rose behind the clouds of Iran 7. The white ground was stained with signs of battle, burned marks, broken gear, and the dark shapes of the defeated Zorans lay half buried in the cold. Dan stood near the shelter's door, looking at the horizon. Nira sat inside, wrapping a cloth around her arm. She had been hurt during the fight, but not badly. Her hands were steady now. They had survived the first attack, but both of them knew it wouldn't be the last. Dan walked back into the shelter. His face was calm, but his mind was full of plans. He closed the door and sat beside Nira. "We did well," he said. Nira nodded. "But they come again." "Yes," Dan replied. "This was only a scout team. The real hunters will come next." Nira looked down. Zorns never stop. If one run, they follow until caught. Dan thought for a moment. He had been alone before. He had fixed machines, handled storms, and even escaped a cave-in once. But this was different. The enemy now had ships and weapons, and all of it was coming because of one small girl who had cried over a meal. But Dan had already made his choice. He wasn't going to run. He stood up and began working. He checked the traps round the shelter. He strengthened the signal jammer and placed metal plates over the windows. Nira helped him, even with her injured arm. She placed batteries in the motion detectors and tested the alarms. They worked side by side like a team that had known each other for years. As night returned, the sky turned darker than usual. The stars above were quiet, but Dan's scanner picked up a signal, a large one. He looked at the screen. "It's a ship, bigger than before." Nira came close. Her face was pale. "That is Hunter's ship. They send 3 again, but stronger ones." Dan turned off all lights inside the shelter. "We'll be ready." They waited in silence. Then the ship landed far beyond the ridge. Dan watched from the roof through an old scope. 3 shapes stepped out, much taller than the last ones. They moved slower, but with more power. Each carried a strong weapon on one arm and a metal shield on the other. Dan and Nira returned inside. "Their armor," Dan said. "We'll need something better." Nira's eyes narrowed. "Use fire." Dan smiled. "I have something in mind." He opened an old crate, marked mining fuel. Inside were 2 large canisters of blast gel. It was used to break rock deep underground, but with the right spark, it could also stop anything that moved. Dan placed the canisters in the snow near the only path leading to the shelter. He connected a wire to the doorway, hidden under a wooden step. Nira watched carefully. "If they break the door," Dan said, "we light it." Nira nodded. "One chance, one light." The night was cold, but they didn't sleep. They waited in silence. Then footsteps. Heavy ones. 3 Zorns approached from the ridge. Their eyes glowed under their helmets. The scanner beeped. The alarms triggered. Dan turned off the noise quickly. He wanted no sounds now. The first Zorn reached the trap line. He looked around, careful. He bent down and scanned the snow. He saw the wires and shouted something in his language. The second one moved to the side, avoiding the trap. The third lifted a blaster and pointed at the shelter wall. Dan and Nira waited inside, holding their breath. A bright flash hit the shelter wall, shaking the room. The metal plates held, but the outer layer cracked. Dan whispered, "Get ready." The Zorns moved fast now. One kicked the door. The lock broke, and the wooden step shifted. The hidden wire snapped. Boom. The blast gel exploded with a roar. Fire and snow flew in all directions. The first Zorn vanished in the flames. The second was thrown back into a rock. The third was hurt but still standing. He limped forward, armor glowing red. Dan picked up the mining laser and fired at the last one. The beam hit the Zorn's chest but bounced off the armor. Nira grabbed the flare gun and aimed for the face. She fired. The flare hit the Zorn's visor, melting it instantly. The alien screamed and dropped his weapon. Dan rushed forward and tackled him. They fell into the snow, rolling, punching, fighting. Nira ran to help. She grabbed a tool and struck the Zorn's arm. The creature pushed Dan off and reached for a blade. Dan saw the knife and acted fast. He pulled out a sharp metal rod and drove it into the side of the armor, where the plates didn't cover. The Zorn gave one final roar, then fell silent. Dan breathed hard, his face covered in sweat and snow. Nira dropped beside him. "It's over," she whispered. Dan looked at her. For now, They pulled the bodies away and covered them with ice. The hunter ship sat silent beyond the ridge. No more soldiers came. Dan walked up to the ship. He placed a small charge on its engine and set a timer. Then he returned to the shelter. With any ERA dot, they watched from a distance as the ship exploded. The snow lit up with red fire. Nira turned to Dan. "You saved me." Dan shook his head. "We saved each other." That night, the stars returned once more. No ships, no danger, just silence. Nira sat near the fire and said softly, "I thought no one would help me. I thought I was lost." Dan smiled. "You're not lost anymore." Nira looked at the stars. "Maybe. Others still out there, like me, hiding, waiting." Dan nodded. "Then we'll find them." She looked at him. "You stay with me," Dan replied, "until the very end." The rescue ship flew back through the stars, leaving behind the hidden moon and the smoke of battle. Inside, Nira sat beside Captain Mark. Her eyes were tired but full of hope. The mission had been hard. Many had been freed, but some were still missing. The Zorans had retreated, but they would return. Nira touched the small star pendant around her neck. It was a symbol of her journey, a gift from Dan, the human who saved her life. Back on Iran 7, Dan stood under the night sky. The cold was less harsh now, but the stars still shone bright. He looked at the stars and thought about the girl who had cried over a meal. That small moment had led to this, a fight for freedom and hope for many. The human base was growing. More ships arrived, more soldiers ready to fight. Dan worked with engineers and scientists to repair the mining equipment and prepare defenses. But his heart was with Nira and her people. One evening, Dan received a message. It was from Nira. "We need help," her voice said. "Zorans gather again. This time, they want to end us." Dan didn't hesitate. He gathered a team of soldiers and pilots. They boarded a ship to join Nira. When they arrived at the hidden moon, they saw the destruction. Forests burned, villages empty, and smoke covered the sky. Nira met them at the landing site. She was stronger than ever. Her voice was steady. "We fight together." The battle was fierce. The Zorans had more ships, more soldiers, and stronger weapons. But the humans and Nira's people fought with courage and heart. Dan saw Nira lead her people through the fight. She was no longer the scared girl from the snow. She was a true leader. After days of fighting, the Zorans began to retreat. The sky cleared, and the stars returned. Nira stood with Dan on a hill overlooking the moon. Below, people celebrated their freedom. Dan gave her the star pendant. "This is for you. A reminder that one small act can change many lives." Nira smiled. "Thank you, Dan. You saved me. You saved us all." Dan looked at the stars. "We saved each other." The hidden moon was free again, and the galaxy had learned something important. No matter how dark the night, a small spark of hope could shine bright.